On October 14, 1942, at 11:42 a.m., in occupied Poland, the air was 6 degrees Celsius and the sky a hard, perfect blue. A German supply train thundered east toward the front, a rolling fortress carrying 3 million Reichsmarks worth of high-octane aviation fuel. 12 armed guards with machine guns protected it. Armor plating shielded it. Nothing could stop it. 400 meters away, hidden at the edge of the trees, a 12-year-old boy named Yosef waited. He wasn't holding a rifle. He wasn't holding a bomb. In his hand was a shard of broken glass. His breathing stayed steady. His pulse barely changed. He wasn't fighting the Nazis with weapons. He was fighting them with physics. He shifted his grip by 2 millimeters and watched for the train to reach the curve. When it did, he caught the sun in the glass. 3 seconds later, the unimaginable happened. The lead fuel tanker didn't simply ignite, it vaporized. A cathedral-sized fireball erupted into the cold autumn sky. Cars derailed, steel curled like wet paper. The guards were incinerated before they even understood what was happening. For the next 2 years, German intelligence would scour the region looking for a mythical British commando unit. They interrogated and tortured hundreds. They studied imaginary bomb fragments. They tore apart entire districts searching for ghosts. They never considered a child, and they never thought to blame sunlight. This is the forgotten story of the youngest and most improbable saboteur of World War II, a boy who turned daylight into a weapon. To understand how a child became a hunter of monsters, you first have to understand the monster itself. By late 1942, Poland no longer resembled a nation. It resembled a cemetery. On paper, the territory was called the General Government. The people knew it as the Cage. In 1939, the Nazis crushed the Polish army in 36 days. 3 years later, the occupation had calcified into a system of controlled terror. There was a kind of silence in the countryside that didn't exist in the cities. Warsaw echoed with gunshots, sirens, screaming. But in small rural villages like the one where Yosef lived, horror had become quiet. Because speaking, even whispering, could mean dying. Yosef was small for his age, underfed, ribs showing through his shirt. He lived with his grandmother, Ewa, in a sagging wooden cottage leaning into the winds at the edge of the forest. Only his grandmother remained. The Germans had taken everyone else. In August 1941, Yosef's childhood ended. An SS truck rolled into the village, not searching for resistance, but for labor. They seized his father and sent him to a factory in Essen. They dragged his mother to a camp whose name villagers were too afraid to say aloud. Through a crack in the floorboards, hiding in the cellar, Yosef watched his parents being hauled into the sunlight. He never saw them again. In that moment, something in him shut off. Where most children would scream or break down, Yosef became emotionally numb, a survival instinct psychologists call emotional blunting, where the mind protects itself by turning off feelings so logic can take over. He became a watcher. He spent hours perched on the roof of the cottage, studying everything that moved, patrols, trucks, but most of all, the trains. Half a kilometer away, the railway line sliced through the valley, the main artery feeding the Nazi war machine. Trains rattled eastward by the dozens every day, armor bound for Stalingrad, winter gear for the Wehrmacht, artillery shells for the siege of Leningrad. Yosef despised them, not with rage, but with focus. He memorized schedules. He noticed patterns. He observed that the fuel convoys, the ones marked with yellow diamond hazard signs, always slowed at a tight bend in the tracks called Dead Man's Curve, where the grade rose sharply. He dreamed of destroying them. But he was 12 years old, weighed barely 40 kilos, possessed neither firearms nor explosives. Mathematically, he posed zero threat to the Third Reich. Then, he broke his grandmother's glasses. It happened by accident. On a hot day in July, she dropped her spectacles, snapping the frame and popping out the left lens. Yosef picked up the loose lens. It was thick, convex, old, flawed, but strong. Sitting on the porch, bored, he rolled the lens in his fingers. The sun was fierce, the sky white with heat. Casually, he focused the light through the glass onto a pine needle on the railing. The pinpoint brightened, becoming painfully intense. A tiny thread of smoke rose. Then, crack, a flame. He stared, stomped it out, and tried again, this time on a scrap of newspaper. It ignited in 3 seconds. This is where physics enters. Physics the Nazis never accounted for. Sunlight delivers roughly 1,000 watts of energy per square meter. A thick reading lens might collect around 20 square centimeters of that energy. Focus it to a pin-sized point, and you create a localized thermal spike. Temperatures at that focal point can exceed 500 degrees Celsius in mere seconds. Dry wood ignites at 300 degrees Celsius. Gasoline vapor ignites at minus 43 degrees Celsius. Gasoline vapor is practically begging to explode. Yosef stared at the burning paper, then at the valley, then at the train tracks. More specifically, he looked at Dead Man's Curve, and he remembered the fuel trains. He remembered the smell those trains left behind as they passed, the faint chemical bite of escaping fuel vapors. German wartime production was frantic and careless. Tanker welds were often sloppy, seals were made from cheap rubber, and on warm days each car traveled inside an invisible cloud of explosive fumes. Yosef had no weapons. But in a sudden jolt that nearly made him retch, he realized that the shard of glass in his hand was not merely something to play with, it was a detonator. The sun was the real weapon, the lens was only the trigger. But a 12-year-old doesn't simply decide to become a saboteur overnight. He had to learn. Over the next 6 weeks, Yosef turned himself into a student of physics and sabotage. He went deep into the forest where no one could see him and practiced. He discovered that angle mattered. The sun shifted across the sky at roughly 15 degrees per hour, and he needed to lead his target accordingly. He learned about focal length, how the glass had to be held at a precise distance to create the hottest beam. Too close, and the light softened into a warm blur. Too far, and it scattered. Precision was everything. He also learned about stability. His hands trembled constantly. Fear, cold, hunger, and every shake disrupted the heat spot. He needed a rest. He built one from fallen branches, a makeshift bipod. He turned the practice into a game, floating bits of bark down the creek and treating them as moving targets. He would track them with the lens and try to burn holes in them before they passed a marked rock downstream. The first week was complete failure. By the second week, he could scorch bark. By the fourth week, he was igniting drifting leaves from 10 meters away. He was ready. But mastering physics was only half the battle. He also had to overcome fear. Because if he failed, if he missed, if even a single glint of reflected light caught a guard's eye, the consequences wouldn't fall on him alone.
The SS would burn his grandmother alive. That was German policy, collective punishment. The weight of that knowledge crushed him, but the memory of his parents, ripped away into the unknown, kept pushing him forward. In October 1942, he chose his moment. Dead Man's Curve. A Tuesday. Always Tuesday, because the heavy Warsaw supply train passed at 11 a.m. every Tuesday. He woke before sunrise, nauseated from nerves. His hands shook so violently he could barely lace his boots. He forced down a small piece of bread, drank water, and looked at his grandmother sleeping. He whispered a farewell she would never hear, just in case. Then he slipped out. The frost was thick on the ground. He moved low and silent, using drainage ditches and brush for cover. Eventually, he reached his chosen position, a cluster of gray rocks on a ridge overlooking the tracks, 15 meters above the rails, 60 meters from the curve, with the sun at his back. Perfect. He prepared his hiding place, clearing dry leaves so he wouldn't ignite anything near himself. He set up his branch bipod, unwrapped the lens, and waited. At 10:40, nothing. At 10:30, a passenger train, useless. At 10:55, he felt the vibration through the earth before the sound reached him. The rails hummed. Then the whistles screamed. A black locomotive emerged around the bend, chugging heavily uphill. Smoke belched from the stack as the cars rattled behind it. He counted them. 1, 2, flatbeds with trucks. 3, a boxcar. 4, the real targets. 6 gray tanker cars, each marked with a dusty yellow hazard diamond. The engine strained against the grade, slowing to roughly 15 kilometers per hour. Yosef held his breath. He placed the lens on the bipod, tilted it. A pin-sized point of blinding light appeared on the tanker's surface. He shifted it, searching for the right spot. Not the steel hull, which would take too long to heat, but the relief valve on top, the safety mechanism designed to vent excess vapor, the weak point, the place where fumes collected. He locked the beam onto the valve. 1 second, the light quivered. 2 seconds, he bit down on his lip until he tasted blood to steady his hand. 3 seconds, nothing. The angle was slipping, the train was pulling away, panic tightened in his chest. 4 seconds, it was all failing. He was foolish to believe this could work. Then he saw it. Not a flame, but a shimmer, like a heat haze rippling above the valve. The vapor was warming. 5 seconds. A deep, muffled whoomp, like air imploding. Then a blast. The valve erupted upward in a 20-foot column of flame. The tanker didn't just ignite, it blossomed. Yosef didn't watch. The instant he saw the flare, instinct drove him into motion. He shoved the lens into his pocket and rolled backward into the ditch behind the ridge. A secondary explosion erupted, shaking the earth beneath him. The tanker had ruptured. Tens of thousands of liters of burning fuel poured over the tracks, engulfing wheels, melting grease, turning metal red hot. The train screamed in mechanical agony. Yosef crawled, not ran, through the mud, staying low so no one would notice movement. Running drew attention. Crawling made him invisible. Behind him, the world was on fire. He could hear shouting now.
He heard German voices echoing through the valley, panic, shouting, the sharp popping of ammunition exploding in the burning train cars. He reached the tree line and finally stood upright, then sprinted. His lungs felt like fire, his legs like molten lead by the time he stumbled into his grandmother's cottage, drenched in sweat and trembling uncontrollably. He rushed to the window. Outside, a towering column of oily black smoke curled into the sky. It was the most beautiful sight he had ever witnessed. He had actually done it. But he had overlooked one disastrous detail. He assumed they would blame the blast on a mechanical failure. He believed his anonymity was guaranteed. He was wrong. The Germans weren't stupid. They were systematic. And now they were going to send someone who specialized in attacks that shouldn't have been possible. The explosion at Dead Man's Curve drew immediate scrutiny. In Berlin, it registered only as a logistical snag, a line crossed out on a supply report. But at the local district headquarters, it set off alarms. 3 days later, a black Mercedes staff car rolled into the village. It didn't stop at the garrison, it drove straight to the crash site. A man stepped out, someone who didn't look like a soldier at all. He looked like an accountant who had traded paperwork for a pistol. This was Obersturmführer Klaus Reinhardt of the Gestapo's technical branch, a counter-sabotage forensic specialist. Reinhardt didn't shout at villagers, he didn't burn homes, not immediately. Instead, he studied the scene with a methodical calm. Though the wreckage had been mostly cleared, the ground still bore scars, the scorched gravel, the warped sleepers. Reinhardt crouched beside the spot where the tanker had exploded and brushed a gloved finger over a shard of metal. He searched for trace chemicals, potassium chlorate, TNT, dynamite, the usual signature of resistance fighters. There was nothing. He examined the embankment next, scanning the tree line. He searched for tripwires, detonator cables, footprints. Again, nothing. He stood there for a long time, staring at the curve. A lieutenant ventured, "Partisans, sir." Reinhardt shook his head. "Partisans leave chaos. Old Soviet mines leave nitrate burns. This is too clean." He looked up toward the ridge where Yosef had once lain hidden. His gaze narrowed. "Too clean," he murmured. Whatever destroyed this train didn't explode on it, it ignited it. He wrote a single word in his notebook: anomaly. He ordered patrols doubled. He ordered the trees cut back 50 meters from the tracks. The noose tightened around a saboteur he couldn't even conceptualize. From his rooftop perch, Yosef watched everything. He saw the Mercedes, he saw the patrols, he watched his precious cover vanish as soldiers felled tree after tree. Fear pooled in his stomach like ice. The Germans were learning. They were adapting. If he returned to the ridge, they would spot him immediately. Most people would have stopped. The rational choice was to destroy the lens and retreat back into anonymity. But Yosef wasn't thinking rationally. He kept remembering the rising smoke, the fear and the German reaction. For the first time in years, they had been afraid. He couldn't stop now. If he wanted to continue, he needed to evolve. Weeks passed, then months. Winter gripped the valley, snow smothering any hope of attack. Without sunlight, there could be no heat. He used the downtime to learn. His first strike was lucky. 60 meters was suicide. He needed distance. He needed precision. He needed to become a sniper. He stole a physics textbook from the ruined school library. He couldn't understand every German word, but the diagrams were enough. He studied the principles of collimation. He realized he needed a better support system, something to eliminate even the faintest tremor. He found a hollow log near the creek and carved a groove into it, creating a stable cradle for the lens. With the log mount, he could hold a beam steady on a target for 30 uninterrupted seconds. Spring 1943 arrived, bringing back the sun's strength. He selected his next target, not a curve this time, but the Nauru River Bridge, a steel truss strategically vital, forcing trains to slow to a crawl to avoid shaking the foundations. But the bridge was fortified with guard towers, searchlights, machine gun nests. The Germans, however, had a blind spot. They watched the riverbanks for boats. They scanned the tracks for mines. They never looked toward the limestone cliffs 300 meters away. 300 meters, a ridiculous distance. At that range, the beam would be delicate, susceptible to wind, dust, humidity. One cloud could ruin everything. But Yosef calculated the sun's angle, At 2 p.m., the light would strike the cliff perfectly. On May 12, 1943, he climbed it. It took him 2 hours to scale the rock face, the lens protected in a sock. He wedged himself into a narrow crevice, invisible from below, a tiny speck lost in stone. The river churned beneath him. The bridge looked toy-sized. At 2:14 p.m., he felt the vibration in the cliff before he heard the rumble. A heavy transport approached. Flatbeds carrying tiger tanks, and in the middle, 5 fuel tankers to feed them. He set the log mount, inserted the lens. The sun pressed hot against the back of his neck. He found the second tanker in his sights. At 300 meters, physics changed. The atmosphere itself became an adversary. Dust, pollen, moisture scattering the beam. He had to wait for the air to still. The train crept onto the bridge. The guards lounged in their towers, smoking, staring at the water. No one looked up. Yosef focused the beam. It appeared faint, nothing like the searing dot from months before. It was a soft, shimmering circle. He held it steady on the valve. 10 seconds. Nothing. 20 seconds. The train was halfway across. 30 seconds. His eyes burned, watering from the glare. "Burn," he whispered, "please." Still nothing. Molecule by molecule, the heat was building, but the tanker was nearly off the bridge. 40 seconds. It was almost gone. He had failed. The distance was simply too great.
Then physics shifted in his favor. The valve seal softened, then gave way. Pressurized vapor hissed outward and met the concentrated beam of sunlight. Ignition. This time it wasn't a fire. It was an outright detonation. The tanker exploded inside the steel truss of the bridge, and the girders acted like a containment chamber, amplifying the shockwave instead of dispersing it. The sound was like the earth splitting open. From his hidden perch, Yosef watched in stunned disbelief as the massive steel structure buckled. The heat from the burning fuel softened the rivets until they groaned apart. The center span collapsed, sending the blazing train, the tanks, and the fuel plummeting 50 meters into the river below. A towering column of steam and smoke rose, swallowing the view. He didn't linger to admire the destruction. He scrambled down the cliff so fast he tore open the skin on his palms. Then he ran. Through the forest, over roots and mud, heart pounding with the ecstatic rhythm of victory. He had obliterated a bridge. He had sent tanks crashing into a river. In that moment, he felt unstoppable. But triumph evaporated the instant he reached the village at sunset. The square was crowded with German soldiers. Trucks idled, and Reinhardt was there, not studying twisted steel this time, but reading from a list. The attack on the bridge had been too devastating. Unable to locate the saboteur, the Germans did what they always did. They punished the innocent. Hidden among the adults, Yosef watched in horror as 10 men were dragged from their homes. The baker, the school teacher, the blacksmith, men who had fed him when he was hungry. Reinhardt stood calmly on the steps of the town hall, adjusting his glasses. Sabotage has a price. If the criminal will not confess, the community will pay his debt. They did not shoot the men. They hanged them, publicly, deliberately, with the entire village, including the children, forced to watch. The cries of grieving women broke the suffocating silence. Yosef couldn't breathe. He stared at the baker's lifeless body swaying in the wind. Then he looked down at his hands, the same hands that had held the lens. He didn't see a hero anymore. He saw a murderer. He fled. He vomited in the garden. He crawled into bed and hid beneath his blanket, shaking uncontrollably. He wanted to smash the lens, throw it into the river, run to the Germans and scream, "It was me!" But he couldn't. Confession wouldn't save anyone. It would only doom his grandmother and the entire village. He was trapped. For 3 weeks he didn't leave the house. He sat in darkness, crushed by guilt, so heavy it felt physical. He barely ate. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the baker's face. But the trains kept coming. At night he heard them, rumbling, whistling, feeding the Nazi war machine that had devoured his parents and now 10 more innocent men. And then he realized something terrible. The Germans had executed 10 villagers to stop him. If he quit now, those 10 deaths would be meaningless. If he quit now, their fear campaign would win. Reinhardt had made a calculation: 10 Polish lives in exchange for safe rail lines. Sitting up in bed, Yosef stared at the moon. He couldn't resurrect the dead, but he could make the German calculation unbearably expensive. He pulled the lens from beneath his mattress and cleaned it. He whispered, "I won't miss, and I won't stop." But Reinhardt was already planning his next move. He had concluded that random reprisals weren't catching the saboteur. He needed to trap the phantom. With new equipment, high-powered binoculars, sound-ranging microphones, he began analyzing the timings of the 2 attacks. The bridge had blown at 2:14 p.m. The curve explosion happened at 11:42 a.m. Both moments corresponded to very particular angles of sunlight. Reinhardt sat in his office, drawing lines across a map, calculating angles, studying the terrain. "He's not using explosives," he muttered, lighting a cigarette. "He's using light." It sounded insane, but it fit the evidence. Reinhardt circled a spot on the map, a high ridge overlooking the Black Forest Strait. It was the only location with the elevation and solar angle required for the next fuel transport. Tomorrow, we watch the sun. Meanwhile, Yosef was packing his bag. He had no idea Reinhardt was preparing an ambush. All he knew was that tomorrow the sky would be clear, and the trains still needed to burn. June 21st, 1943. The summer solstice, the longest day of the year. For Obersturmspurherr Reinhardt, it was the perfect day to spring a trap. He deployed his men not along the tracks, but inside the forest itself.
Reinhardt had positioned snipers high in the trees, camouflaged beneath green netting. He'd established a command post on a hill overlooking the Black Forest Strait. He wasn't watching the tracks at all. He was watching the ridge lines. He was watching for sunlight. "Wait for the glint," he instructed his best marksman, a veteran named Mueller. "A reflection, glass, a mirror, anything that throws light." By 1 o'clock, the sun was merciless overhead. Heat rippled across the rails. Reinhardt checked his watch. The fuel convoy would arrive in 14 minutes. On the opposite ridge, 400 meters away, Yosef was already set up. Exhaustion hollowed his eyes. He hadn't slept in 2 days. The image of the baker's swinging body haunted his every blink. But he was there because he could not do otherwise. For him, this was no longer about strategy. It was defiance. A refusal to let the occupiers crush what remained of him. He secured the lens in the wooden mount, adjusted the angle. This was the longest attempt he had ever made, 450 meters. At that range, the focal point was microscopic, the margin for error non-existent. He heard the train long before he saw it, an iron monster,
Double locomotives pulling 20 cars, 12 of them tankers. It was bound for the Kursk salient, where the largest tank battle in history would soon explode. Without this fuel, German armor would grind to a halt. He inhaled slowly, steadied his trembling hands. On the opposite ridge, Reinhardt raised his binoculars and scanned the ridge. "See anything?" he asked. "Nothing, sir," Mueller murmured, his eye fixed to his scope. "Just rocks." The convoy thundered into the straightaway. Yosef caught the sun. He drew the beam down onto the third tanker, a tiny, quivering needle of light. "Come on, burn," he whispered. Reinhardt saw it, a sudden razor-sharp flash on the ridge. Too bright, too unnatural. "Contact!" he shouted. "Sector 4, gray rocks, fire!" Mueller squeezed the trigger without hesitation. Crack. The bullet slammed into the stone 6 inches from Yosef's face. Shards blasted into his eyes. He flinched, instinctively jerking back. The lens slipped from its groove. "I see him!" Mueller barked. "It's a child! He's running!" "Kill him!" Reinhardt roared. Yosef grabbed the lens and rolled away as bullets churned the dirt where he had been lying. Zip! 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 The snipers had found their target. He scrambled down the backside of the ridge, crawling and sliding, but something crucial had been left behind on that mount. The beam. For 3 full seconds before the first shot struck, the beam had remained fixed on the tanker's valve. It was enough. The vapor inside was already at flashpoint. Just as Mueller chambered another round, physics finished what Yosef started. The explosion didn't sound like a blast. It felt like a force ripping the air apart. The third tanker didn't merely explode, it vaporized. The shockwave slammed Reinhardt onto his back. The locomotive derailed at full speed. The entire convoy, thousands of tons of fuel and steel, jackknifed into a wall of fire 1/2 kilometer long. Trees bowed and snapped from the pressure wave. A sniper tumbled from his perch. Reinhardt's staff car shattered. Yosef didn't look behind him. He ran into a valley drenched in smoke, which shielded him from scopes and rifles. He kept running until his legs failed, and he collapsed into a ditch, gulping air and clutching the lens tight against his chest. He was alive. The train was annihilated. Across the valley, Reinhardt rose slowly, brushing dust from his coat. He stared at the inferno devouring the tracks, then at the empty ridge. He understood that he had lost. The saboteur had escaped. But he also understood something else. He had seen the boy. He knew the size and shape of the enemy now. "Search every village," Reinhardt ordered, voice like ice. "A boy, 12 or 13, burns on his hands. He will have glass." The hunt began, but nature intervened. 2 days later, a wall of heavy gray clouds rolled in from the Baltic. The temperature plunged. Snow began to fall, the first of the winter. The sun vanished. Without sunlight, Yosef was just a boy again. He sat by the window, staring at the leaden sky, waiting for a break in the clouds. None came. November bled into December. Winter smothered Poland in darkness. Reinhardt searched for 3 months. He interrogated children. He inspected homes. But without new attacks, the trail froze. The German high command grew impatient. They needed Reinhardt elsewhere. On the collapsing Eastern Front, in January 1944, he was reassigned. He left the village with the case still open, marked unsolved. The ghost had disappeared into the winter. Yosef never struck again. The war rolled forward. The Soviets swept through in 1944. The Germans retreated. Occupation ended. Yosef's grandmother died the following spring, peacefully in her sleep. She never lived to see freedom, but she died knowing her grandson had survived. Yosef buried the lens with her, wrapped in the same rag he had used on every ridge. It had always been her weapon. It belonged in her hands. He stood over the grave, 14 years old, utterly alone. He had killed dozens, destroyed equipment worth millions, altered the course of battles, and then he walked away in silence. Detroit, Michigan, 1987.
The ventilator hummed softly, mixing with the sharp scent of antiseptic. An elderly man lay in the hospital bed, his breaths shallow but steady. His name was Joseph. To everyone who knew him, he was an ordinary retired machinist from the Ford plant, a man with 3 children, 7 grandchildren, a love for baseball, and a lifelong dislike of fireworks he never explained. A young graduate student sat beside him, holding a small recorder. "Tell me about the war, Joseph," he said gently. "Did you fight?" Joseph coughed, staring up at the ceiling tiles as if they were a distant sky he'd seen long ago. For 40 years he hadn't spoken of any of it, not to his wife, not to his children. Who, after all, would believe him? "I didn't have a gun," Joseph whispered at last, his voice brittle. "I had glass." "Glass?" "The sun," Joseph murmured, eyes drifting shut. "I used the sun." And then, slowly, he told the story. The trains, the curve, the destroyed bridge, the baker who swung from a rope, the investigator who hunted him across the forests. The student kept recording, capturing every detail. But when he typed it all up later, he dismissed it with a single word in his notes: senile. He filed the tape into a cardboard box in the university basement. There it sat, untouched, gathering dust for 3 decades. In 2018, military historian Dr. Helena Zimmerman was deep in the German Ninth Army archives, combing through old logistics documents, when she stumbled upon a peculiar folder. Gestapo case file, Yanarov, Sector 7B, the phantom saboteur of Silesia. She read Reinhardt's meticulous notes. Attacks occur only on clear days. Evidence suggests concentrated thermal ignition. Suspect is unusually small, possibly a child. Zimmerman froze. A half-forgotten fragment of memory surfaced, a strange oral history interview from Detroit. She tracked down the recording and began cross-referencing the dates. October 14th, 1942, the first destroyed train. Joseph's voice on the tape: "I hit my first one in October. It was a Tuesday." October 14th, 1942 was a Tuesday, and the weather records showed crystal-clear skies. The bridge collapse also confirmed. The final attack matched perfectly. Her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a fantasy. It was real. She published her research, and for the first time the world learned the name of the boy who had fought with sunlight. But Joseph never knew. He had died 2 weeks after that interview in 1987. His grave was modest, no medals, no inscriptions hinting at what he had done. Yet, if you travel to that Polish village today, climbed the ridge above the old railway line, and look closely, the evidence remains. Scorched stones, rock faces melted into glossy black glass, not burned by flames, but vitrified by a heat so intense that it defied belief. The last mute witnesses of an impossible war. We tend to think wars are decided by massive armies, roaring tanks, and powerful generals. But history is crowded with ghosts, small people, overlooked people, people like Yosef, who were too insignificant to notice, too fragile to fear, and too desperate to surrender.
He proved you don't need an army to wound an empire. You don't need a rifle to kill a monster. Sometimes all it takes is a shard of broken glass, the patience of stone, and the courage to stand alone in darkness and catch the light. This is the story of the sun gun, the impossible, true account of the boy who burned the Reich. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of World War II, hit the like button. It helps us find more forgotten histories. And subscribe, because there are still blank pages in the past, and we're going to fill them in together.